Hi everyone, thanks for joining us for this episode of Cross Currents. I'm Ben Fawcett with CG Wealth Management. With me today is Rod Phillips, Vice Chair, Canaccord Genuity and former Finance Minister of Ontario. In this episode, we'll be digging into the election of Mark Carney and what this means for the economy, what it means for businesses, and what it means for the average investor. We'll be talking policy, and we'll be talking market impact. So let's kick it off, Rod. Let's set the stage here. This is the fourth consecutive Liberal government, third consecutive Liberal minority government. What's changed here as far as tone and mandate?
Well, Ben, I think that's a question everybody is measuring right now. But so far, I think what we've seen from this Prime Minister is a very different approach in terms of focusing on some very specific issues, and obviously we've got huge issues in front of us. So nothing focuses the mind like a major trade war with your number one trading partner. But I also think we're seeing a difference in tone. This is someone who has worked in settings that require a more decisive approach, who's confident when it comes to the economy. I think I've heard it said, Mark Carney thinks more about the economy before breakfast than Justin Trudeau probably thought of it maybe ever, and that's by nature of being an economist and being focused on it. So I think there's that. There's also a real refreshed sense of priorities for the country, and I think that came out of the election. There was a very unique and in many ways historic debate, a really two-way choice that people made a choice, but a real focus, even an alignment around the times that we're in. And I think what we're seeing from Prime Minister Carney is a very deliberate focus on issues and on the issues that Canadians are focused on. And I think certainly at the end of the previous Liberal government led by Justin Trudeau, there was a real sense of being adrift to the point where even for a chunk of time, people felt like we didn't have a Prime Minister.
Yeah, the complete vacuum at that stage. Perhaps let's dig into the sort of key priorities that Carney is going to sort of face. I don't want to use that American analogy of the first 100 days, but we can sort of work within that window. Yep. You could argue the ballot issue that Carney was elected on, or certainly what propelled him, was his ability to deal with Trump and the tariff issue. He went down to the White House on Tuesday. They got along great. How is this relationship going to build out from here?
Well, getting back to where we started, it couldn't have been much worse. In terms of at least the sense of falling off a cliff from what had been historically a very stable, both political and trading relationship to the situation that we were in for the previous, call it 4 months. So I think what we saw with the election of Carney and what we saw on Tuesday in Washington was the stabilizing of that relationship. I think the Prime Minister was really clear about a few things. The sovereignty discussion, he basically said isn't on. It doesn't stop the President from poking at it, but he said it isn't on. He also made the point about the importance of Canada as a customer, and in that sense, I would say very politely refuted the President, who sort of said, we don't need this, we don't need that. He said, well, listen, we're your biggest client, right? And I think as importantly, or probably more importantly, behind the scenes, started a process where there can be real dialogue and discussion. And both leaders emphasized the fact that the renegotiation of either CUSMA, if you're in Canada, or the USMCA, which just in case anybody's ever wondered why the names are different, it's just a matter of what letter you put in front. So in Canada, we start with Canada. In the US, they start with US.
I've always wondered that.
Yeah, but it's the same agreement. And in fact, Trump heralded that agreement, which was somewhat of a different position than he'd taken before. Quite clearly, an element of this was about personal animus between the former Prime Minister and the President. But a big chunk of this is also about Trump's belief about tariffs and beliefs about a new arrangement need to be made. And we're recording today on the day that Donald Trump announced the new UK-US trade agreement. Yeah. Again, an example in his mind of rebalancing that trade relationship, and one that the UK agreed to. So I think all of those factors played into a better day than we'd had in a while. Yeah. But now the hard work begins.
Yeah. And coming down to that, at this stage, Trump basically has a trade war with China, Europe, and much of the globe at this stage, one he probably can't single-handedly win. Is this an opportunity for Canada in the sense that he does need a few allies? And is this something Carney can capitalize on? Is there an off-ramp?
We hope so. I mean, but yes, and the obvious opportunity would be to be inside the envelope of trading opportunities as a trusted neighbor with a good security relationship. Many of the things, by the way, he said about the UK today, but able to have a mutually advantageous relationship. On the other hand, Trump made it clear, sitting there in a very professional way, that we don't want your cars, we don't want your steel, we don't want your aluminum. So he's clearly laying down some markers. The other, of course, huge opportunity, and maybe the one that we need to see as equally important, and something that the Prime Minister and the Premiers have grabbed onto, is what we do that we can control ourselves. So Carney has also said that by Canada Day, and I assume he means this Canada Day, we're going to get rid of interprovincial trade barriers.
Yeah.
Now, lots of people say, well, why is that so hard? Well, there's lots of reasons why that's hard, but the real reason to know it's hard is it hasn't happened literally in 100 years. These trade barriers have existed.
Yeah.
But now we have alignment of the premiers, we have alignment of the Prime Minister. We also have the alignment of the other party, Pierre Poilievre's Conservatives, who also were in favor of that. Yeah. So there's a broad consensus around that. So there are a number of these items, I think discussions about energy corridors, discussions about other things that may end up, 10 years from now being more important. Yeah. Because we can only control so much with the U.S., but what we can do to make ourselves more viable and more effective as a country, that's on the front burner now in a way that it hasn't been.
And I wanted to dig into that interprovincial trade aspect because it gets talked a lot, both Liberals and Conservatives supportive. There's been a lot of international study and domestic study as far as this could help GDP 4 to 8% in studies I've seen. To your point, this hasn't happened before. What exactly has to happen, and what can Carney do to make it happen now?
And the way our country works with the Federation, what he can do on his own is important, but not sufficient. What he needs is the alignment of the provincial premiers. The reason, and I can say this from my own time as the Minister of Finance, the reason these things don't happen is because there are a number of interests in each of the provinces that have an interest in maintaining access and protection in their market. Yep. Not that different than different countries. In fact, it's people have pointed out sometimes that it might be easier to be a British Columbia company, to bid on business in the United States than a British Columbia company bidding on business in Ontario. And there are a number of reasons for this. But the ability to tackle those, first of all, there's a longer term project because it's built into regulations and rules and other elements that have literally taken generations to put in place. But an overarching change and a commitment to eliminating those trade barriers will make a big difference. We've already seen some movement by Ontario and some of the eastern provinces who have more or less unilaterally agreed that we're just going to not enforce these things. There's a great example that was used about safety vests and the fact that if you were a construction company in New Brunswick or Nova Scotia, you had to have a different kind of safety vest than if you were in Ontario. It's literally just a safety vest, the thing you're wearing. And whatever the origins of that was, it was an impediment to Ontario companies because if you wanted to bid in New Brunswick or a New Brunswick company in Ontario, you had to buy a whole new set of safety vests. These are the kinds of, to the absurd, to some very serious questions that'll have to be answered around some bigger industries. But the commitment by Carney and the premiers to do this, the support of the opposition party, the Conservatives in doing this, means we could really get it done. By this Canada Day, that's pretty soon, but I think we should hold them to that. Yeah.
Never waste a crisis, though. So, he's going to use the impetus to push that.
Yeah, dig in, and he met with the premiers after his meeting. And again, there are certainly tensions. We'll talk about what's happening out west and some of those concerns. But again, by answering and being responsive to those and being different than the previous government in how it's handled, there's great opportunity.
Yeah. Actually, moving to what's going on out west, particularly Alberta, Saskatchewan, energy policy, Ontario Premier was saying, Carney needs to do more for those specific provinces. What can Carney do?
Well, he can do a whole lot. There has been both in tone, but also in fact. I think it is absolutely fair to say that the energy policy and the environmental policies and focus of the federal government has not been good for resource production in our country, and particularly not good for those two provinces that focus on carbon-based extraction. And so when Carney says and reaches out to Premier Smith, obviously Premier Smith and Premier Moe of Saskatchewan, Premier Smith of Alberta, indicated before the election that they had certain requirements. Mm-hmm. Following that, Premier Smith, in fact, allowed to go forward some legislation on referendum, which could lead to a sovereignty referendum. But Carney's responded to that by meeting and speaking with her about the priorities they have from an energy point of view. I say in tone, it's interesting that the Prime Minister is going to have a First Minister's meeting in person, which has not happened in a while, but he's having it as well in Saskatchewan.
Yeah.
And so he's not only in substance, and of course the substance will take time to show, and there's going to be tensions in that, because there are still important opinions in the Liberal Party that relate to the environment and climate and other items. But I think energy is going to be a great test for him and for the government. And again, you have alignment, even, I wouldn't call it alignment, but potential interest in Quebec around some of those things. Again, the pressure of this situation with Trump has really made people focus. So I think that conversation then turning into action. Remember, if we talk about building pipelines, this takes 5, 8, 9 years if we do everything well. So these are projects that will take a long time to get going. But these are projects that literally couldn't even get started in the past with the previous Liberal government.
Yeah. And, he also has a history as far as climate and green issues to some extent. Does that come into play, or is it a more pragmatic approach at this stage?
Again, I think that is where we started. People are waiting to see, the proof is in the pudding, as my mom would have said. Everything he has talked about has suggested a pragmatic approach, which again doesn't mean an approach that has to abandon objectives related to the environment or climate. It is entirely rational to think that Canadian clean liquid natural gas would be a great replacement internationally for coal in some other countries, particularly in Asia. And that as part of a climate transition, that might be a great contribution that could be made to climate, to improving our situation with the climate, but also not punishing provinces and workers and industries that focus on resource extraction. Similarly, around critical minerals and mining, these are all ideas that are, even when governments agree to do something, doing it is hard.
Yeah.
But what we might be seeing for the first time in a decade is real alignment about what's to be done.
And then it's execution, sweating the details to actually get it across the line.
Which nobody should underestimate. Yeah. I always say when you're looking at government trying to understand them, look at what they say, and that's where most people stop. But look at how good they are at executing, just like you would with a business. And the third thing is then there's a reaction. There's always government can decide to do something, but there's a response. So look at what the people who are responding both positively and negatively done. But frankly, in Canada, we haven't been able to get to alignment on the first. So I think that's important. Now we need to also focus on delivering. And that's going to have political trade-offs. That's going to have costs that are going to, some be borne by the taxpayer, some by others. And that's going to have impacts. But I think, that alignment of not just the government, but the opposition party and the premiers, we haven't seen that in quite some time.
Yeah. I actually want to move it over to the tax side of things, because that's another area where, Carney has talked about spending, but also tax cuts. The deficit will stay elevated for the foreseeable future. He's looked at income tax cuts. What about corporate alignment with the U.S., the corporate tax cut side?
Yeah, we haven't heard a lot about that, and I think it points to a bigger reality that, again, our situation with Mr. Trump is pointing out to us. For a long time, Canada's alignment with the United States and the U.S. economy was almost taken for granted. That was on important fields like taxation, both personal but particularly corporate taxation, things like depreciation rates, but also tax rates, regulation in terms of regulatory requirements, particularly on things like the environment and various cross-border regulatory comparisons, and also even things like the cost of money. It is interesting that a U.S. 10-year is more than a full percentage point more in terms of its return than a Canadian 10-year. So over the last, and I think it's really been the last 5 years, we've really seen those things start to diverge. And I think that has been to the detriment of the Canadian economy. Now, that was for policy choices and priorities that the previous government, and not just the federal government, other governments set. But it only makes sense if the United States is going to continue to remain important to us, which regardless of trading elsewhere and many good things that we can do, the United States is still going to be our primary trading partner. Those kinds of differences will start to, over time, in our driving business decisions. So businesses decide where to locate.
We're already seeing that.
A tariff is one thing. Yeah. But before there were tariffs, there were many Canadian businesses making choices at a minimum about expansion, about where they'd expand based on the corporate tax rate, based on the depreciation rate, based on the nature of the regulations and how hard it was to do business. Those are problems that predated Trump. And I think, Carney and his government, particularly with his background, certainly understand that. And I think what we should hope for, but we haven't quite heard yet, is moving back to a closer equilibrium. Certainly getting rid of the retail carbon tax was an example. So for instance, Canadian transport companies that are going cross-border aren't paying that much, much more for fuel and many other things. But this is an area that really relates to the broader productivity of the economy, and it's an area that everybody's talked about. And again, maybe this is going to be the impetus to do something.
Yeah, I mean, there was a time prior to the original Trump tax cuts where U.S. companies would re-domicile to Canada. Waste Connections, a huge Canadian company, is an example of that for better tax rates here. But I think subsequently we've seen capital flow the other way.
It'll be. Again, I think we're dealing with a prime minister who understands the ins and the outs. Also clearly has his views on other important issues like the environment and how he balances that. And then, as I said, how he actually gets things done. One thing to say it, another thing to do it. That's going to be how people will measure him, and that's fair.
Yeah. And then I suppose that's the taxation side. The other side is the spending, as far as where he's going to, you can spend and invest and grow the economy as a result, or you can spend and just raise the deficit and debt.
Well, this has been, his, I don't want to misquote him, but I basically said more investment, less spending, which may sound, and is a little bit of a wordplay, but underneath that, if we think about it from a business perspective, there are certain types of investments that we make that there's a return on that's evident, right? We buy a new machine, the machine has productivity, we know that payback on that machine. The definition of what was investment and even what was infrastructure started to be expanded during the previous government, and I think not just, again, the federal government, around social infrastructure, where indeed there might be benefits, and we wouldn't question those benefits, but there weren't necessarily productivity benefits. So more rail, new roads, better power plants, these things drive economies directly. Education, better educated workforce, yes, that's good. There's a continuum of investments that governments make, but clearly what he's been talking about is the kind of investments that tangibly contribute to productivity, and that will mean perhaps not investing in some other things. But that, as it is in a business for a country or a province, that's a much more sustainable way to build out your assets and therefore build out your economy.
Yeah, and grow that productivity in the process. I wanted to come back to the Canadian economy and impacts a bit later on, but first I actually just want to pivot a bit to Trump, the Trump administration and the sort of global tariff trade war, you could argue, as far as, we've seen him come up with a framework agreement with the UK, which is fairly questionable. He said positive things recently about trade deal with China. Do we see an off-ramp as far as Trump trying to take this issue to the sidelines and move on to others?
Wow. Yeah, who knows? It is interesting to see what appears to be a pivot to solutions. So the argument would go that some things had to be broken, but now they have to be put back together. And the real question is, can you break everything and then trying to put everything back together again, or if there's specific areas like China or others, do you focus on those? And the approach that the administration chose to take was to break everything and now reconstruct it in a constructive way. I think obviously our trade issues are critical. The EU's issues are critical. But really, when we're looking at it from a macro point of view, the China-US relationship is the one to watch. And this weekend, there's to be some discussions that will be the start of something one imagines in Switzerland. But that is so fundamental and such an integrated part of the global economy that until we find out if we're going to have distinct trading spheres, the US and China, and pick a team, or if there's going to be integration, it becomes very hard to configure these things. How does that affect Canada? One of the things that no doubt is going to come up in the context of Canada-US discussions is whether we can bring Chinese goods here, and not just the kind of national security issues we've had before, but others, because you can easily see a cross-border trade developing. If your iPhone in the US is $2,500 and it's $1,100 here, then we'd all want the iPhone franchise in the Niagara border.
For Canada to get into.
And so I think without the resolution of that issue, and listen, it's great that they're starting to have meetings, how those dynamics will play and how that affects the other deals and what restrictions or expectations might be put on people who want to be inside the US sphere or inside the Chinese sphere just aren't going to be clear.
Yeah, yeah. And the other side that we've talked about is the tax cuts. And that was initially a lot of the impetus for what Trump wanted to do to raise revenues. What's the latest on that? And is that still going to happen, do you think?
It's, a huge priority for many of the voters that supported the president. I think is a fallacy that the tariff revenue could replace the tax revenue. The numbers just don't. It's apples and a watermelon in terms of the size of revenue. And of course, from a Canadian perspective, it would even further put that tax disparity in place, putting even more pressure on Canada to be competitive in that regard, or see both individual taxpayers and businesses flow south. I think there's a real question, given the relatively small majority he has in the House of Representatives, how he's going to get that through. But let's face it, this is a person it has been a mistake to underestimate what he might be able to get done. So, as I said, there's a lot of balls in the air. It's a great time for us to focus on the things we can focus on, but we also have to have at least one eye understanding how these dynamics are unfolding. China trade, tax cuts, these are the sorts of things that are fundamentally going to drive the flexibility they have to deal with us.
And I wonder if that discussion of tax cuts in the US is the impetus that the Canadian government then needs to bring up that discussion, which politically could be quite difficult to have, but probably needs to be addressed.
Yeah, I think we're at a time where a lot of those things are coming on the table. Personal income tax cuts would be one of the most immediate things at the higher end. Would be one of the most immediate things you could do to stop the flow of Canadians and their money flowing south. That said, a remarkably difficult political thing to do because tax the rich is actually quite popular, and the country has its own fiscal challenges. But these are all conversations that now can happen in the context of if someone had said by Canada Day of 2027 there'd be no interprovincial trade barriers 6 months ago, people would have said, what are you smoking, right? So I think everything has the potential now to be on the table, and I do think we are fortunate in that the Prime Minister's background as an economist is he does understand these things.
Yeah. So bringing it back to the Canadian economy again, putting this together as far as Connie's priorities, what's going on in the US, and if I'm looking at the Bank of Canada right now, inflation seems to be under control or somewhat contained. Growth is anemic, and so some of Connie's policies, be it fiscal spending, increase in provincial trade, could all be quite stimulative for the Canadian economy. Just your thoughts as far as, what happens? Does the Bank of Canada keep cutting rates, or are we going to sit here?
I think, there's maybe three big factors to watch. We talked about the US, and the Fed decided not to cut its rate, and I think that spread has to be a consideration. Right? You talked about the inflation concerns. We don't understand what the dynamics are going to be, what reciprocal tariffs will be in place, what they won't. But in general, there's a consensus there's going to be inflationary impacts. And as you said, should we start to see success from an internal trade perspective, that could be inflationary. So there's definitely inflationary pressure. The big pressure that is not talked about enough relative to keeping rates low or lowering them, though, is the number of mortgages coming up for renewal. There are a significant number of Canadians whose mortgages will be renewed and are being renewed. And at higher rates, this is meaning $1,000, $1,200 a month for people, fundamentally changing their own economic situation. And so there is real pressure to at least maintain the rates at the level they are and not see them going higher. And certainly if we want to spur the kind of growth we want to see in housing, obviously lower rates or the same rates would be better. So where that goes, I'm not sure, but I think those are three of the big pressures that are going to be on the bank. And I think they'll be closely watching what happens, obviously, with the overall trade and economy situation. They'll be closely watching the Fed. And I think the fact that they didn't move is maybe a signal, again, to keep that differential where it needs to be. But don't underestimate the pressure on both the governor and on the government around those mortgages, because that's really affecting affordability, which even with Trump, when he pulled Canadians during the election, affordability was still the number one issue. And another $1,000 a month, that affects anybody.
Yeah. And that is a key distinction, as you mentioned, between US consumers who have actually a pretty solid balance sheet now and Canadian consumers who are very indebted at this stage. Putting all this together then, at this stage, what are we watching in the next 100 days? And Do you think there's enough there as far as where the Canadian economy is to start really sort of, getting a bit more optimistic? We've certainly seen the Canadian dollar show some strength, which would suggest markets are getting more positive.
Yes, I will need to see a bit more before I get optimistic. I think it is reasonable to assume, with all of the actions that were taken earlier, particularly by Trump and President Trump on these tariffs, like these are now working their way through the systems. There's actually an app you can get to track the container ships. You can watch them turn around. In the middle, and so all of these factors are highly disruptive to the global economy and to the Canadian economy. There's still specific uncertainty with regards to big sectors of the Canadian economy. And as we've talked about, there were issues before. I think, we are going to continue to see, I don't want to say we know go up or down, but I think it's entirely possible things could get worse before they get better. Which, if it is a correction that's necessary and it's something that happens, then that is part of the economic cycle. I mean, we have, for a variety of reasons, avoided recession in any kind of significant way in Canada for a very long time, and that is an anomaly. Although we have, people who've been in the workforce for a decade who've never experienced what would be considered a non-COVID, a non-man-made caused recession. But I think this, from an investor perspective, watching those variables and understanding that if that does happen, that is what happens in economies, right? The real question is, where do we end up on the other side? And I am more optimistic based on what we're seeing about the relationships, much more civil with the United States, based on the country's focus on its own priorities, much more optimistic about Canada in the medium and long term.
Yeah, I will add to that is we've seen in the US what huge amounts of government spending can do to really sort of prop up and drive an economy. Yeah. And, we're going to be experiencing that in Canada, so that can be very stimulative. Yeah. Tax cuts can definitely help to some extent. Yeah. So there are definitely some positive themes from a Canadian economic standpoint. Bringing it back then, as far as investment themes in the stock market, perhaps I'm taking a slightly more positive spin on it. Yeah. And, I would focus on some of the more cyclical aspects of the economy, which could get a little bit more interesting. Certain consumer stocks, for example, certain transportation on the industrial side. Just a few other investment themes that you can see from this point.
Listen, clearly energy is, and the in its various forms, is a priority. We're also seeing, there's these other events. We see Spain and Portugal blacked out. We see, the investments required in infrastructure, really. So the companies that are creating that infrastructure and supporting that infrastructure, in addition to the actual energy producers. I think, when we see, there are certain products like our potash and other things that are just in demand, and you can tell now that they're in demand because, even under the tariff regimes, there's opportunities made for those. I think it'll be interesting to watch the Canadian industrial sector in terms of what it does. Clearly, a lot of anxiety that is eased off somewhat, yeah. Right, in terms of pressure. So where there's opportunities there. So I think it's but on any given day, the president says he's going to put 100% tariff on movies, right? Yeah. And suddenly an industry that was just minding its own business, yeah. And entertaining us all, yeah. Suddenly, and so I do think that is likely to be a continued feature of Donald Trump being the president of the United States. Yeah. And I think we all are going to have to get used to that kind of volatility and try to, as they say, eliminate, listen for the signal in the noise. Yeah. How much of this is the entertaining show, which is the sort of daily reality show that we get out of the White House, and how much of this is really consistent with the themes that he's been talking about, and how can we take advantage of them? Listen, depending on what happens, there could be great opportunities as other countries continue to be increasingly excluded to the extent that we're not. For Canadians and Canada to be that base to really have a foundation in the North American economy.
Yeah, I think it's partly why the Canadian dollar has been so strong is because we could be that conduit into the US for foreign players, or we can fill that vacuum too if the US isn't going to be trading with Europe and Japan to some extent. To wrap up, I sort of wanted to bring it back to Connie's legacy, if you like. He's an economist, PhD economist by training, Bank of Canada, Bank of England. is his legacy going to be economic and what he's done for the economy, or is that what he wanted to be, or is there a broader legacy he's thinking about?
I think it's early to say, but one of the things we know if we read history is that events often create the man or the woman in terms of the opportunity, right? And there can be a brilliant prime minister at a particular time, and if it's a kind of boring time, they do a good job. That's great. But these clearly are times when the events are calling for something extraordinary, and it could go very well or not go very well. I mean, my own view is that, 5 years from now, Canada, Ontario will be, much better off or much worse off. I'm not sure there's a flat outcome.
Yeah.
And so for the prime minister, who we would expect is going to be there, likely for 4 years, maybe less with a minority government, but likely for 4 years, if that moves up, it's going to be hard for there to be anything but an economic legacy.
Yeah.
But of course, as we know, that drives everything, right? If we can pay for things, we can have things. If we can pay for things, we can protect and defend our borders. If we can pay for things, people are getting the kind of opportunities that makes young people want to stay in Canada. We often talk about how it's so hard for young people to afford homes, and that's true, but that's really putting the cart in front of the horse. Where there's opportunity, where there is, a vibrant economy, then people can have careers that are both rewarding financially and in other ways, and they can afford a home. Right. So even though there's a supply issue, we need to build more homes. We also need to make sure the economy is a place where people can build careers and families and futures. So the events have picked Mr. Carney. Mr. Carney has picked his time, and he's going to be an impactful prime minister, and we should all hope for the good.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a great spot to wrap up the discussion.
Thanks,
Lots
Ben.
more to talk about in the future, though.
Thank you, Ben.
Thank you.